And they're wonderful combinations because they know the military guys and the policemen know the procedure. On screen, the crew of USS Enterprise looked united, exploring music space as one team. But off-screen, unity was far harder to find. At the center of it all was William Shatner, whose larger-than-life presence didn't always sit well with his fellow cast members. What began as small disagreements slowly grew into lasting music, resentment with actors like George T. and others openly speaking out years later. Stories emerged, perspectives clashed, music and friendship strained, and as more details surfaced, fans realized the tension behind Star Trek. The original series was far more intense than anyone imagined. How failure created Captain Kirk. Long before he was music, commanding a starship, William Shatner was just a struggling actor trying to find his footing in his hometown of Montreal. His early days were rooted in amateur theater and radio, and the reality of that life was far from glamorous. Music, money was tight, so tight that surviving on a couple hundred a month was considered normal. He later opened up about that period in his autobiography Up Till Now, painting a picture of just how lean those years really were. To stretch what little he had, music, he relied heavily on a cheap fruit salad from a Kreska's lunch counter in Ottawa, sometimes eating it once music or twice a day. It was survival mode, plain and simple. That small, repetitive meal became a symbol of how far he was from the success people now associate with his music name. Things finally began to shift when he landed a role at the Stratford Shakespeare Festival. That opportunity gave him real exposure, and more importantly, credibility. From there, he gradually transitioned onto the screen, setting the music stage for what would become a defining role in television history. What's surprising is that when Star Trek was first coming together, Shatner wasn't even the studio's top choice. The original music pilot, titled The Cage, didn't feature Captain James T. Kirk at all. Instead, the lead was Captain Christopher Pike, played by Jeffrey Hunter. But when executives at NBC reviewed it, they weren't convinced. The pilot was rejected, forcing creator Gene Roddenberry to completely rethink the direction of the show. Behind the scenes, there were also tensions surrounding Hunter's involvement. According to Shatner's later reflections in Star Trek Memories, interference from Hunter's personal life didn't sit well with the production team. Combined with network demands for major changes, Roddenberry made a bold decision: replace Pike entirely and build the show around a new captain, James T. Kirk. Even then, Shatner still wasn't the first pick. Jack Lord was initially favored for the role, but negotiations fell apart when he pushed for creative control and to share the profits. The studio wasn't willing to make that deal, so they turned to Shatner. He fit the role, came at a lower cost, and ultimately became the face music of the franchise. Roddenberry reshaped the series with a stronger focus on action and energy, developing episodes like Where No Man Has Gone Before, The Omega Glory, and Mud's Women. When Shatner stepped in, he brought something subtle but crucial, a lighter, more human touch to the character dynamics. He recognized that a crew on a long mission shouldn't feel stiff or distant. They needed chemistry. That shift helped transform the show from a rejected concept music into something audiences could connect with. When the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, aired in 1966, Star Trek Finally Music secured its place on NBC. Over the next 3 years, it presented a vision of the future that felt both bold and hopeful. A world beyond war, poverty, and division, where exploration and unity music defined humanity's path forward. Part of what made the show stand out was its commitment to diversity. Michelle Nichols played Uhura, a black woman in a position of authority on the bridge of the Enterprise, which was, I prefer this response, groundbreaking for the time. One of the show's most talked about moments came in music, when she and Shatner shared an on-screen kiss. While the scene had a science fiction explanation within the story, music, its cultural impact was undeniable. There were concerns from the network about how audiences, especially in more segregated parts of the country, would react. An alternate version of the scene was even attempted, one that would obscure the kiss. But Shatner and Nichols reportedly made sure those safer takes wouldn't be usable, ensuring the moment aired as intended. It became one of television's defining milestones, regardless of ongoing debates about whether it was technically the first interracial kiss on screen. Despite its influence, Star Trek struggled with ratings during its original run. Its mix of science, music, fiction, philosophy, and social commentary was ahead of its time and not always easy for mainstream audiences to latch on to. The network kept shifting its time music slot, eventually placing it on Friday nights at 10 o'clock p.m., a slot widely seen as a dead zone for viewership. By 1969, the show was canceled. For Shatner, the end of the series marked a difficult chapter. While he continued to pick up guest roles on shows like Mission Impossible and Hawaii 5, his financial situation took a serious hit. At the time, music reruns and syndication weren't yet the industry standard, and actors weren't guaranteed residual payments. The idea that Star Trek would one day become a global phenomenon simply didn't exist yet. In the early 1970s, Shatner found himself in a situation that felt almost unbelievable given his fame. He was broke, recently divorced, and at one point living out of a truck near Los Angeles. It wasn't a symbolic struggle. It was real. He converted the back of his pickup into a makeshift living space, complete with basic necessities, and traveled from job to job with his dog by his side. He later described that period as rocky, though that barely captures how uncertain things really were. Still, much like the character that would eventually define his legacy, Shatner pushed through. And just music. When it seemed like Star Trek had quietly faded away, something unexpected happened. Even after its cancellation, the show refused to disappear. Through syndication, it kept popping up on television screens again and again, slowly building a loyal and passionate fan base. What started as a short-lived series was turning into something much bigger. By the early 1970s, that growing audience was impossible to ignore, and it opened the door for William Shatner to step back into a role that made him famous. This time, lending his voice to Star Trek, the animated series. The animated series didn't run long, just 22 episodes, but its impact was bigger than its episode count suggests. It brought back much of the original cast, gave fans fresh stories, and most importantly, proved that the demand for Star Trek hadn't gone anywhere. Behind it all, Gene Roddenberry remained determined. He wasn't ready to let the franchise fade, and he kept pushing forward. That persistence paid off. By 1979, Roddenberry succeeded in bringing the crew back to the big screen with Star Trek, the motion picture. For Shatner, it marked a full-circle moment, a return not just to Captain Kirk, but to a version of the story that finally had the scale and recognition it always deserved. The film performed strongly at the box office, and that success changed everything. What started music as a canceled TV show suddenly became a full-fledged film franchise. Throughout the 1980s, a series of sequels followed, each one bigger than the last. And with music, that growth came a dramatic shift in Shatner's fortunes. During the original run, he had been earning around $5,000 per episode. Now he was commanding millions per film. It was a complete turnaround. The same actor who had once struggled to make ends meet was now at the center of a global phenomenon, proving that Star Trek's real story didn't end with cancellation. It was only just getting started. Shatner's most controversial era begins. By the 1980s, once the Star Trek films started dominating at the box office, Paramount knew they were sitting on something bigger than just a movie franchise. This was a universe people still cared about deeply, and the studio began seriously thinking about bringing it back to television. But there was a problem nobody could ignore. Rebooting something this iconic had never really been done before. And behind the scenes, there was a lot of hesitation. Nobody wanted to be the one who got it wrong. So when Star Trek, The Next Generation, was announced in late 1986, it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a risk. And not everyone was ready to take that leap, especially the fans. For many of them, Star Trek without Kirk, Spock, and McCoy didn't even make sense. It felt like trying to replace music, lightning in a bottle. Even William Shatner, the face of the franchise, wasn't exactly thrilled. Instead of calming things down, he went public with his doubts, questioning whether the studio was stretching the name too far and risking the quality fans had come to expect. It only made the tension worse. At that point, the idea of a new crew stepping onto the Enterprise felt less like evolution and more like betrayal. But time has a way of flipping music narratives. Once The Next Generation actually hit the air and proved itself, becoming a massive music success in its own right, the noise started to fade. Eventually, even Shatner came around, sharing the screen with a new cast years later in Star Trek. Generations, what once felt impossible, suddenly became part of the same legacy. Still, if 1986 was a turning point for franchise, it was also the year Shatner had one of the most awkward moments of his career. While guest hosting Saturday Night Live, he stepped into a sketch that would follow him for decades. At the time, Star Trek fandom wasn't what it is today. It wasn't mainstream. It was seen music as niche, even a little strange outsiders. The sketch was simple on paper. Shatner would play himself showing up at a Star Trek convention, meeting fans who were deeply, intensely invested in the show, and he leaned all the way in. The performance was sharp, exaggerated, and music, clearly meant as satire. The audience in the studio loved it, but the fans' music it was poking at, that reaction was a lot more complicated. Before the sketch even really got going, the tone was already set. The title alone signaled where things were headed. Then Shatner's character stepped out and started firing off questions, mocking the intensity of the fans, even going as far as telling them to get a life. To some viewers, it was hilarious. To others, it felt like a line had been crossed. Decades later, the reaction is still split. Some fans look back on it as a classic piece of comedy, a moment where Star Trek showed it could laugh at itself. Others never really got past the sting of it. Rod Roddenberry, the son of Gene Roddenberry, was firmly in that second group. He saw the sketch as disrespectful, arguing that the character of Kirk stood for curiosity, empathy, and open-mindedness, not ridicule. When his opinion went public, it reignited the debate all over again, and Shatner's response completely on brand. Instead of backing down, he embraced the controversy and even turned the phrase into the title of his memoir, Get a Life. It was his way of owning the moment, whether people liked it or not. Not long after, the focus shifted back to the films, but the behind-the-scenes tension didn't exactly disappear. By the time Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, went into production in 1989, things were already starting to feel off. This time, Shatner wasn't just starring, he was directing. The story itself raised eyebrows from the start. Instead, music, of exploring new civilizations, the crew was chasing something far more abstract, the idea of God. Producer Harv Bennett, who had helped guide the franchise through some of its biggest successes, wasn't.